Hey guys, my name is Matt Johnson with whoismatt.com, and we've really been seeing Sony and Canon go back and forth with camera releases this year. Between the R5, R6, and A7S III, filmmakers have a ton of choices for mirrorless cameras. But now, at the end of 2020, we're starting to see more competition forming in the cinema camera space between these two companies. Sony fired first on September 6th with a development announcement of the FX6, a little brother to their very popular FX9 full-frame cinema camera that released in 2019. Canon followed soon after on September 24th and took the wraps off the C70, their first RF mount cinema camera. Finally, on November 17th, Sony fully unveiled the FX6, which means that we finally know the specs and capabilities of these two cameras. Today I want to compare the C70 and FX6, talk about their video specs and capabilities, and tell you which one I would recommend you purchase if you're in the market for a cinema camera. Alright, starting off, the first thing you will notice that's different about these cameras is how they are built. Whereas Canon has gone for more of a hybrid DSLR cinema camera look, which to me kind of looks like a shorter, slightly overweight 1DX, Sony has instead gone with a more traditional yet smaller video camera form factor. The FX6 looks like a shrunken down version of an FX9 or FS7. Looking at the C70, I feel like Canon went with a camera design that would be familiar to filmmakers that are accustomed to a DSLR or mirrorless camera. If you're coming from a DSLR or mirrorless hybrid, the C70 isn't too much bigger, and it should still feel very familiar. Keeping with the oversized DSLR theme, Canon chose to go with an integrated approach, where the screen and grip are permanently attached and a part of the camera. Much like their 6D or R5 and R6, it's impossible to remove the screen and put it on a different part of the body. Unlike a DSLR though, Canon opted to not include an EVF with this camera. If I had to theorize why, it was probably to save cost, but it's a bummer considering that Canon's earlier cinema cameras like the C100, etc. did include an EVF. Touching on audio for a second now, Canon did opt to include two mini XLR audio inputs as well as a 3.5mm stereo input on the camera body. While I, as well as many filmmakers I know, wish these XLR inputs were full size, it makes sense that Canon wanted to keep the C70 as small as possible. Contrasting with Sony now, because they chose to go with a more traditional video camera style for the FX6, it is going to be significantly more modular than the C70. For starters, the monitor is not permanently attached to the camera and can instead be mounted in a variety of ways. This modularity also makes it easier for you to attach a viewfinder, which may be more difficult on the C70, if not impossible, because the way that camera's screen articulates. In addition, the top handle and side grip of the FX6 are detachable, which can make the camera much smaller, unlike the C70 with its integrated side handle that cannot be removed. This modularity does come at a price though, because perplexingly, Sony opted to only include XLR audio inputs on the camera's top handle, meaning that if you remove the handle to make your setup smaller, the camera no longer has audio inputs and is limited to a small internal microphone. This is definitely an oversight and something to keep in mind if you want to record something like a walk and talk interview where the FX6 is mounted to a gimbal while recording high quality audio. In that case, you would need to use an external audio recorder. Moving internally, let's talk sensors. The C70 has a super 35mm size camera sensor, which is roughly the same size as an APS-C sized crop sensor on a DSLR or mirrorless camera. Canon has said that this is the exact same sensor that is in the significantly more expensive C300 Mark III. Not bad considering that camera costs $11,000. In front of the sensor you have Canon's new RF lens mount, which, while there are not a ton of RF lenses currently available, the ones that are available are very impressive, and I'm sure they're working on adding new ones. Thankfully, Canon has also made an EF to RF lens adapter that works very well to adapt their very extensive line of EF lenses to the C70. In comparison, Sony includes a full-frame sensor in the FX6, which is significantly larger than the C70's. In addition, I've been told by Sony that this sensor is roughly equivalent to the sensor that is included in the A7S III, meaning that it is a low light champ, and I would expect it to beat the C70 in a high ISO test. The FX6 sensor has Sony's E-mount in front of it, which means you have a wide variety of lenses to choose from, including lenses like their new FEC 16-35mm cinema lens. From a pure sensor size perspective, I have to give the win to Sony. But this is where things start to get really interesting. See, while the C70 has a super 35mm sensor, Canon has also created a lens adapter for this camera. The Canon mount adapter EF EOS R 0.71X. Don't let the boring name fool you, because this lens adapter is actually super cool. With it, you can take your EF mount full frame lenses, adapt them to the C70, gain an extra stop of light, and in the process, it will increase the field of view of these lenses, turning the C70 super 35mm sensor into essentially a full frame sensor. It's pretty magical. Now, granted, it does cost $600, and as I said, it only works with EF lenses, not Canon's new RF lenses. But this is still very impressive, and puts the C70 and FX6 on essentially an even playing field from a sensor size standpoint. Moving on to frame rates now, things start to look much more similar between these two cameras. The C70 can record in DCI 4K at up to 120 frames per second, and 1080p at up to 180 frames per second. And it can record all of these frame rates in 422 10-bit. The FX6 does slightly worse than the C70 in that it can only record DCI 4K at up to 60 frames per second, but it can record UHD 4K at up to 120 frames per second. As an added bonus though, the FX6 can also record in 1080p at up to 240 frames per second. Not a bad upgrade if you like super slow motion. Of course, all of these frame rates are in 422 10-bit as well. You should also be aware that just like with the Sony A7S III, the FX6 requires you to use CF Express Type A memory cards if you want to record 4K all-I at 120 frames per second and 1080p all-I at 240 frames per second. The C70, on the other hand, is capable of recording all frame rates and bit rates to SD cards, so no need to worry about another memory card. Looking at external recording now, here is another area of difference between these two cameras. Whereas the C70 is incapable of any sort of internal or external RAW video, the Sony FX6 can externally record ProRes RAW video over SDI to an external recorder like an Atomos Shogun. So Canon wins if you need a bit more resolution with 4K DCI at 120 frames per second. But if you want 1080p at 240 frames per second and external ProRes RAW recording, the FX6 is the clear winner in this category. You want to talk about autofocus? Let's talk about autofocus. For a long time, Canon has led the pack with its legendary dual pixel autofocus system. And I have good news. The C70 includes dual pixel autofocus as well, so you can expect stellar autofocus performance with this camera. That said though, you should be aware, while the C70 will do face and head tracking, it does not support eye detect autofocus. So if you've been using the R5 and loving the eye detect AF, unfortunately, that isn't included with the C70. And as far as I'm aware, there's no animal eye detect autofocus either. Sorry, Philip Bloom. Meanwhile, in Sony land, they have essentially taken the stellar autofocus system from the A7S III and put it in the FX6, meaning you have face and eye detection, a little bonus over the C70. Autofocus is an area where Sony have been making great strides in the past few years, and at this point, I think Sony and Canon are pretty dang close in terms of autofocus performance. So both of these cameras are great for autofocus, Matt? Great, glad they're even and we don't have to talk about this anymore and can move on. Well, hold on for just a second, because this is where things start to get a little complicated for Canon. As I said, the C70 has phenomenal autofocus, but that comes with a big caveat that you need to be aware of if you're using it with Canon's 0.71x lens adapter to make it a full-frame camera. See, while that adapter will essentially make the C70 a full-frame camera, it is only capable of increasing the size of the image that is being recorded. It is not capable of increasing the amount of autofocus points that are available on the camera sensor. What this means is that while you may be recording a big, beautiful full-frame image, autofocus is only going to be working in a much smaller, super 35mm sized section at the center of the image. Specifically, in an interview with a Canon rep that I will link to down in the video description, Pro AV TV was told that by using the 0.71x lens adapter, you will only have autofocus points covering the middle 60% of the image. Unlike the FX6, which has autofocus points across the entire sensor, the C70 with the adapter will really only have autofocus points in the center of the image. So, if you are wanting a full-frame cinema camera with amazing autofocus, I really have to recommend that you choose the FX6. Talking about colors here for a second, everybody loves Canon colors, right? They're pretty much universally praised. And the good news is that with the C70, they're pairing these great colors with a wider dynamic range because this camera includes C-Log 2 and C-Log 3. On the other hand, you have Sony, which has always been praised for its high dynamic range, but not always for its colors. The good news is that the FX6 has Sony's new S-Cinetone picture profile, which straight out of camera looks gorgeous and still gives you a wide dynamic range. Of course, if you want even more dynamic range though, you can choose to shoot in S-Log 3 on the FX6 as well. So that said, I wouldn't necessarily let colors or dynamic range dictate which one of these cameras you want to buy. Both should be impressive in that regard. Almost to the end, let's talk about one more big thing. ND filters. One of the main reasons that filmmakers invest in a cinema camera over a mirrorless is the added inclusion of ND filters, which makes shooting low f-stops even in the very bright sun easy. Impressively, even with its relatively small width, Canon has still managed to cram ND filters inside, which provide up to 10 stops of light reduction. In contrast though, with Sony, and if you've used any of their other cinema cameras, you know where this is going, the FX6 has what is known as an electronic variable ND filter, meaning that instead of multiple levels of glass that slide into place to provide different levels of darkening like the C70, the FX6 has one piece of glass that can dynamically change how dark it is, down to 7 stops of light reduction. This lets the FX6 do some really cool stuff, like automatically adjusting the level of ND filtration so your footage stays properly exposed without adjusting your shutter speed or aperture. Once you try it, you won't want to go back to a traditional ND filter. So, while the C70 wins in pure light reduction performance with 10 stops versus 7 stops on the FX6, the electronic ND of the FX6 is arguably more compelling of a feature. Wrapping up, those are the major differences between these two cameras. Otherwise, they're pretty similar, with both capable of using larger batteries for enhanced battery life, both recording an unlimited amount of time, and both being covered by a zillion buttons. All this means is that the last thing that we really need to talk about is price. At $5,500, the C70 is more affordable than the FX6, which comes in at $6,000. But hold on a second, because if you want to make the C70 full frame, you need to buy the 0.71x adapter, which is going to set you back $600, thus making the C70 $100 more than the FX6. So if I was you, and I was trying to determine which one of these two cameras to buy, I think the first thing you need to ask yourself is, how invested are you in the Canon ecosystem? Do you already own a lot of Canon lenses? Are you comfortable shooting with Canon cameras? Do you love Canon colors? In that case, it's a no-brainer. I would gladly choose the C70 because it looks like a fantastic camera that's going to serve you very well. But if you are not heavily invested in Canon, or if you are considering jumping ship to Sony, and you want a camera that's going to give you a more modular and traditional cinema camera design, if you want more frame rate options, if you want raw external recording, if you want stellar autofocus performance across an entire full-frame sensor, and if you want one of the coolest ND filters available in any camera today, in that case, the FX6 is the obvious choice, and the one that I would wholeheartedly recommend. With that, thank you so much for watching this video comparison between the C70 and FX6. If you want to see more video comparisons in the future, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Also, do you happen to be a wedding filmmaker like me? In that case, you probably want to book more couples and film more weddings. To help you out with that, I've created a free guide that's going to walk you through some practical steps to book more couples and film more weddings. It's a completely free gift to you. You can download it at the link down in the video description. Thanks so much for watching and have a great day.